Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that Hitler's chemists created to keep Wehrmacht soldiers fighting through bullet wounds, and that now keeps heroin addicts alive in clinics across America. Methadone started as a Nazi military project to solve Germany's morphine shortage before World War II, became a closely guarded pharmaceutical secret, then got repurposed decades later into the most controversial addiction treatment in medical history. The same chemical compound designed to make war more efficient now prevents roughly 350,000 overdose deaths per year. Here's the twisted part. The scientist who invented it in 1937 had no idea their painkiller would end up blocking heroin from working in human brains, creating a treatment based on substituting one opioid for another. They just wanted to keep soldiers from screaming. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand methadone, you first need to understand the pharmaceutical nightmare Germany faced in the mid-1930s. The country possessed the world's most advanced chemical industry, but depended entirely on foreign opium for medical morphine. Poppy fields in Turkey, India, and Southeast Asia supplied the raw materials that German pharmaceutical giants like Bayer and Hoechst processed into painkillers. This worked fine during peacetime, but Adolf Hitler wasn't planning for peace. His military strategists calculated that any major European war would immediately cut Germany off from opium-producing regions controlled by Britain, France, and their allies. The Wehrmacht needed morphine by the ton for battlefield medicine, yet Germany couldn't grow poppies in sufficient quantities and didn't control any colonies with suitable climates. The situation created a medical arms race nobody talks about. While Hitler publicly ranted about racial purity and Lebensraum, his health ministry quietly panicked about drug supplies. German soldiers in World War I had consumed morphine in staggering quantities, both for legitimate wounds and to cope with trench warfare's psychological horror. By 1918, an estimated 200,000 German veterans had returned home dependent on opiates, creating a social crisis that lasted throughout the Weimar Republic. Pharmacies dispensed morphine with minimal oversight. Doctors prescribed it for everything from toothaches to depression, and addiction rates climbed steadily through the 1920s. The drug that made surgery possible and battlefield injuries survivable also destroyed lives with mechanical efficiency. Germany's pharmaceutical industry had built its global dominance on synthetic chemistry. Bayer had already created heroin in 1898 as a non-addictive morphine substitute, which proved spectacularly wrong within a decade. The company's chemists had synthesized aspirin, various barbiturates, and dozens of other medications by modifying natural compounds or building entirely new molecules. If they could synthesize dyes, explosives, and insecticides from coal tar, surely they could create a painkiller from basic chemicals. The Reich Ministry of Health established the goal clearly: develop a fully synthetic opioid that matched morphine's effectiveness, but could be manufactured without poppy plants. Failure meant German soldiers would face bullets, shells, and bayonets with inadequate pain relief. The assignment landed primarily with IG Farben, the massive chemical conglomerate formed in 1925 by merging Germany's largest pharmaceutical and chemical companies. IG Farben operated like a scientific empire, employing thousands of chemists and running laboratories across Germany. The company had already developed synthetic rubber and gasoline from coal, solving other military supply problems. Now the challenge involved replicating morphine's molecular structure, or finding an entirely different compound that produced similar effects. The chemists understood the stakes perfectly. Hitler's government demanded results, and IG Farben's executives needed government contracts to maintain their industrial dominance. Two names emerged from IG Farben's ranks: Gustav Erhardt and Max Bockmühl, chemists working at the Höchst facilities in Frankfurt. Neither man was particularly notable before 1937, just competent industrial researchers conducting systematic experiments. Their methodology followed standard pharmaceutical practice of the era: modify existing compounds slightly, test them on animals, document results, then try new modifications. Morphine's chemical structure was well understood by the 1930s, so they began by creating variations on its molecular framework. Most attempts failed immediately. Test animals either showed no pain relief or died from respiratory depression. A few compounds worked briefly but caused seizures or violent reactions. The research dragged through 1935 and 1936 with mounting pressure from government overseers. Hitler's rearmament program accelerated every month, and military planners needed answers about medical supplies. The chemists worked 6-day weeks, synthesizing compounds that mostly ended up in disposal drums. The breakthrough came not from brilliant insight, but from systematic variation of a promising molecule. Erhardt and Bockmühl had been modifying a compound called pethidine, which showed mild pain-killing properties. They adjusted its structure repeatedly, adding chemical groups, removing others, changing the spatial arrangement of atoms. In September 1937, they synthesized compound number 10820 in Höchst's numbering system. Animal testing revealed something unusual. Rats injected with Höchst 10820 showed significant pain tolerance, remaining calm when exposed to heat and pressure that normally cause distress. The effect lasted far longer than morphine, remaining active for 8 to 12 hours instead of 3 to 4. Respiratory depression occurred, but less severely than with morphine at equivalent doses. The compound's chemical structure barely resembled morphine despite producing similar effects, suggesting it worked through the same brain receptors, but via a different molecular pathway. This was novel enough to warrant human trials, though the testing protocols of 1937 would horrify modern medical ethicists. IG Farben began limited human testing in 1938 at affiliated hospitals. Patients scheduled for surgery received the compound as an anesthetic, while others with chronic pain conditions tried it as morphine replacement. The results proved encouraging but complicated. Höchst 10820 relieved pain effectively and lasted impressively long, making it ideal for situations where frequent dosing was impractical. However, it produced different subjective effects than morphine: less euphoria, slower onset, and a peculiar quality patients struggled to describe. Some found it unsatisfying compared to morphine's warm rush, while others appreciated its steadier, less intoxicating character. The drug definitely worked, but it wasn't simply synthetic morphine. The Nazi government showed immediate interest despite the compound's quirks. Military doctors needed battlefield painkillers that kept soldiers functional rather than euphoric. A drug that relieved agony without producing morphine's dreamy intoxication seemed ideal for combat medicine. The Wehrmacht's medical corps wanted soldiers who could still follow orders and handle weapons, not drifting in opiate bliss. Höchst 10820's long duration meant medics could dose wounded men less frequently, conserving supplies and reducing the risk of overdose from repeated injections. The Reich approved the compound for military use and assigned it the brand name Polamidon, though some historical accounts claim doctors informally called it Dolafine, after Adolf Hitler himself. Production began at IG Farben facilities in 1939, just as Germany invaded Poland. The pharmaceutical complex at Höchst manufactured Polamidon alongside other military medical supplies, sulfur drugs, stimulants like Pervitin methamphetamine, and various anesthetics. Wehrmacht medical units received shipments prioritized by military need, with frontline hospitals getting first access. German military records from the war's early years mention Palamidon frequently, though historians have pieced together its use from fragments since the Nazis destroyed many documents before surrender. Wounded soldiers received injections that kept them stable for transport to rear hospitals, and chronic pain cases got oral tablets for longer-term management. The drug served Germany throughout the war, though production difficulties and Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. IG Farben's factories became prime targets as British and American air forces recognized their strategic importance. Pharmaceutical production continued even as cities burned, with technicians working in damaged facilities to maintain output. Palamidon wasn't the miracle weapon Germany needed, but it solved the morphine shortage problem completely. The bitter irony: German chemists created a superior painkiller that would eventually save millions of lives, but only after their government's collapse. The Wehrmacht used it to patch soldiers and send them back into a war of conquest and genocide. By 1945, IG Farben's executives faced war crimes tribunals for using concentration camp labour and manufacturing Zyklon B gas. The company's pharmaceutical achievements were swept up with its atrocities, creating a complicated legacy. Höchst 10820 remained relatively unknown outside military medical circles, overshadowed by more sensational Nazi science projects. The compound sat in German hospitals and Wehrmacht stockpiles, waiting for someone to recognize its potential beyond battlefield analgesia. That recognition would come from American pharmaceutical companies sifting through conquered Germany's scientific archives, looking for anything valuable among the ruins. They would find a painkiller invented by fascists and turn it into addiction medicine's most controversial tool. The IG Farben laboratories in Frankfurt operated like a pharmaceutical factory, designed by pessimists who expected everything to fail. Rows of chemical hoods vented toxic fumes while technicians in stained coats recorded failed experiments in leather-bound notebooks. Ehrhardt and Bockmuehl worked in this environment of controlled desperation, tweaking molecular structures with the systematic boredom of assembly line workers. Their breakthrough with Höchst 10820 came from modifying diphenylpropylamine compounds, a family of chemicals that bore no visual resemblance to morphine's complex ring structure. The molecule they created looked nothing like the opiate alkaloid every other researcher tried to copy, yet it unlocked the same receptors in mammalian brains with key and lock precision. Methadone's chemical formula, C21H27NO, contains just carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, arranged in a specific three-dimensional configuration. The crucial element involves two phenyl rings attached to a central carbon chain, creating a shape that mimics morphine's active sites despite completely different architecture. Think of it like a knockoff key that opens the same lock through coincidental geometry rather than identical design. The molecule's flexibility allows it to bind mu-opioid receptors throughout the brain and spinal cord, triggering the cascade of cellular events that shut down pain signals and produce euphoria. What made it different was how long it stayed bound to those receptors compared to morphine's brief attachment. Morphine floods the brain rapidly, hits receptors hard, then metabolizes within hours. Methadone creeps in slowly, settles into receptor sites like a squatter claiming abandoned property, and refuses to leave for 24 to 36 hours. This pharmacokinetic difference seemed minor in 1937, but would later prove revolutionary. The chemists observed it first in laboratory rats subjected to tail flick tests, where animals pulled their tails away from heat sources when pain tolerance was exceeded. Morphine-dosed rats showed sensitivity returning after 4 hours, while Höchst 10820 dosed rats remained pain-tolerant for 12 hours or longer. The compound accumulated in fatty tissues and released slowly into the bloodstream, creating steady effects rather than morphine's spike and crash pattern. German pharmaceutical research in the 1930s benefited from a disturbing openness to human experimentation that predated the Holocaust's full horrors. Hospital patients, psychiatric inmates, and prisoners received experimental compounds with minimal consent or oversight. Höchst Tessin 820 entered human trials in 1938 through hospital networks affiliated with IG Farben, where doctors administered it to surgical patients and chronic pain sufferers. The early reports noted excellent analgesia, but strange subjective effects. Patients described feeling functional rather than floating, maintaining mental clarity that morphine obliterated. Some complained the drug felt mechanical or cold compared to morphine's warm embrace, a distinction that would later prove medically significant. The irony of Nazi racial ideology producing this drug runs deeper than most people realize. IG Farben's research drew heavily on international pharmaceutical literature, including work by Jewish chemists the regime had expelled or murdered. Scientific knowledge doesn't respect borders or bigotry. The molecular structure of methadone emerged from global chemistry, even as Hitler's government tried to purge non-Aryan science. Ehrhardt and Bockmuhl weren't party ideologues, just chemists doing their jobs in an increasingly totalitarian state. They synthesized a molecule, documented its properties, and collected their salaries while Germany spiraled toward genocide. The compound itself carried no moral weight, just chemical properties that would outlast the regime by decades. Wehrmacht Medical Corps began using palamidon in September 1939 during the Polish invasion. Field hospitals received shipments of amber glass ampules containing the clear solution, labelled with IG Farben's Höchst subsidiary markings. Military doctors injected wounded soldiers who then endured rough transport to rear medical facilities without screaming through every pothole. The drug's long duration meant casualties could be stabilized once and moved hundreds of kilometers before requiring another dose. This efficiency appealed to German military logistics, where every saved morphine vial meant one more available for future wounded. Combat medicine during World War II was brutal triage. Stop the bleeding, kill the pain, move to the next casualty. Palamidon served this nightmare with cold effectiveness. Reports filtered back through Wehrmacht medical channels, describing the compound's performance under battlefield conditions. Soldiers with abdominal wounds, shattered limbs, and severe burns received injections that kept them manageable during surgery and recovery. The drug produced respiratory depression like all opioids, slowing breathing to dangerous levels in high doses, but doctors learned the dosing parameters through trial and deadly error. Some patients died from overdose when medics accustomed to morphine's shorter action gave repeat doses too soon. Others developed tolerance, requiring increasing amounts to achieve the same pain relief. The Nazis documented these findings meticulously, creating pharmaceutical data through human suffering on an industrial scale. German military physicians noticed something else about palamidon that wouldn't make sense until decades later. Wounded soldiers previously dependent on morphine transitioned to the new drug without experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. When morphine supplies ran low at certain hospitals, switching patients to palamidon maintained their comfort and functionality. The doctors attributed this to both drugs being opioids with similar effects, missing the deeper mechanism. Palamidon didn't just relieve pain, it occupied the same neural receptors that morphine activated, preventing withdrawal by maintaining opioid presence in the nervous system. This cross-tolerance between different opioid molecules would later become the foundation for addiction treatment, but in 1940 it was just a convenient clinical observation. IG Farben ramped up production as the war expanded across Europe, North Africa, and eventually the Soviet Union. The Höchst facilities manufactured palamidon alongside methamphetamine tablets that kept tank crews and pilots awake for days, creating a pharmaceutical arsenal for blitzkrieg warfare. Factory workers synthesized the compound through multi-step chemical processes involving toxic intermediates and dangerous reagents. The production lines ran continuously, supplying military stockpiles that grew throughout 1941 and 1942. Germany's pharmaceutical industry proved remarkably resilient to Allied bombing initially, with production shifting to underground facilities and dispersed smaller plants when major factories sustained damage. The Allied air campaign intensified in 1943, turning German industrial cities into rubble fields. Höchst's main facilities in Frankfurt suffered repeated strikes that destroyed buildings and killed workers. Chemical production continued in damaged structures, with technicians working around bomb craters and exposed to weather through blown-out walls. Palamidon synthesis required precise conditions and pure reagents, but wartime Germany made do with improvisation and declining quality control. The tablets and ampules reaching frontline medical units varied in potency and purity as raw material shortages worsened. Still, production never completely stopped even as the Reich collapsed. By 1944, Wehrmacht medical records showed extensive palamidon use across all theatres of war. Doctors in Normandy bunkers, Eastern Front field hospitals, and Italian mountain clinics all logged the drug in treatment records. The compound had proven itself superior to morphine in several respects: longer duration, steady effects, and easier manufacturing from coal-derived chemicals rather than agricultural opium. If Germany had won the war, palamidon might have replaced morphine in global medicine within a decade. Instead, the Reich's defeat meant the drug would disappear into Allied intelligence files, waiting for American pharmaceutical companies to rediscover it. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The final months of Nazi Germany saw IG Farben's executives destroying documents and hiding assets, trying to escape war crimes prosecution. The company had used concentration camp slave labour at several facilities, worked prisoners to death manufacturing chemicals, and collaborated enthusiastically with SS medical experiments. When American and British forces occupied German industrial regions in spring 1945, they found pharmaceutical plants still operating, stockpiles of medications including palamidon, and filing cabinets full of research data. Military intelligence teams specifically targeted IG Farben sites, knowing the company held valuable patents and trade secrets. Among thousands of chemical formulas and clinical reports, they found Ehrhardt and Bockmühl's work on Höchst 10-20. The compound itself sat in warehouses and hospital pharmacies across occupied Germany, amber ampules and white tablets marked with German labelling. Allied medical personnel initially ignored it, using their own morphine supplies for treating casualties and displaced persons. But intelligence officers recognized pharmaceutical intellectual property as valuable war spoils, particularly synthetic compounds that didn't require agricultural raw materials. The United States and Britain began systematically cataloguing German chemical patents, including thousands related to pharmaceuticals, dyes, plastics, and explosives. Höchst 10-20's documentation went into this archive, noting its use as a long-acting analgesic with properties distinct from morphine. The discovery remained classified and largely forgotten until American pharmaceutical companies started reviewing captured German research in the late 1940s. Palamidon had no commercial presence and carried the toxic association of Nazi military medicine, making it unappealing for immediate development, The compound sat in technical reports, waiting for someone to see its potential beyond Wehrmacht battlefield use. That moment would come from an unexpected direction. Not from pain management specialists looking for better analgesics, but from researchers who would stumble onto its ability to prevent opioid withdrawal. The Nazis had created a molecular key that could lock out heroin, and they never knew it. The Wehrmacht distributed Palamidon throughout its collapsing front lines during 1944 and early 1945, creating a scattered pharmaceutical trail across Europe. Field hospitals in retreating German armies left behind medical supplies when they fled Allied advances, including cases of the synthetic opioid that most Allied medics didn't recognize. American troops entering captured German facilities found warehouses full of medications labelled in Gothic script, many with unfamiliar chemical names. Military pharmacists catalogued the discoveries systematically, sending samples and documentation back to medical intelligence units tasked with evaluating enemy pharmaceutical capabilities. Palamidon ampules and tablets went into this collection, noted as a morphine substitute with extended duration but no immediate strategic importance. Operation Paperclip began in earnest during summer 1945, bringing German scientists to America along with their research files and technical knowledge. The program focused primarily on rocket scientists and physicists, but pharmaceutical chemists also attracted attention from US military intelligence. IG Farben's facilities became prime targets for technical exploitation teams who photographed documents, seized samples, and interviewed surviving researchers. The company's executives faced war crimes trials at Nuremberg in 1947, charged with slavery, mass murder, and crimes against humanity for their concentration camp factories. While prosecutors presented evidence of IG Farben's role in genocide, other American officials quietly catalogued the company's pharmaceutical innovations for potential commercial development. The intellectual property seizure operated under a legal framework that treated German patents as war reparations. American pharmaceutical companies could access IG Farben's research without paying royalties or acknowledging German origins, essentially looting decades of chemical innovation. Thousands of patents covering dyes, plastics, medications, and industrial processes transferred to US control, creating windfalls for companies that could commercialize the technology. Höchst Kestest 28's documentation sat in this massive archive, waiting for someone to recognize its commercial potential beyond military analgesia. The compound had no brand recognition, carried Nazi associations that would repel consumers, and competed with established morphine products that doctors already understood. Eli Lilly and Company obtained rights to the compound in 1947 through negotiations with the US Alien Property Custodian, the office managing seized German assets. The Indianapolis-based pharmaceutical manufacturer saw potential in a long-acting synthetic opioid that required no poppy cultivation and could be produced entirely in American factories. However, marketing a drug called Palamidon or Dolafine with obvious German origins presented public relations problems in a country that had just defeated Nazi Germany. Lilly's marketing department chose a new name, Methadone, derived from the chemical structure's methyl and diphenyl components. The rebranding erased the compound's Wehrmacht history, presenting it as a modern American pharmaceutical innovation rather than recycled Nazi military medicine. American physicians received methadone as simply another addition to the post-war pharmaceutical explosion. Antibiotics, new sedatives, improved anesthetics, and various synthetic medications flooded the market between 1945 and 1950, transforming medical practice. Methadone entered this landscape positioned as a long-acting analgesic, useful for chronic pain management where repeated morphine dosing proved impractical. Hospitals used it for cancer patients experiencing constant agony, post-surgical pain control, and conditions like severe arthritis. The drug worked exactly as German military doctors had documented: slower onset than morphine, extended duration requiring less frequent administration, and effective pain relief with somewhat different subjective qualities. Eli Lilly's product information emphasized methadone's synthetic origin and domestic production capability, appealing to Cold War anxieties about foreign drug dependence. The United States had fought World War II with morphine supplies, vulnerable to Japanese control of Southeast Asian poppy-growing regions. A fully synthetic opioid manufactured from American coal and petroleum derivatives offered pharmaceutical independence from unstable foreign sources. This strategic argument helped methadone gain acceptance in military hospitals and Veterans Administration facilities, where planners worried about future conflicts disrupting medical supply chains. The drug's Nazi origins remained unmentioned in medical literature, though some physicians recognized the German research underlying its development. Methadone's early American use followed conservative prescribing patterns appropriate for any potent opioid. Doctors understood it carried addiction potential comparable to morphine and prescribed it cautiously for legitimate pain conditions. The drug filled a useful niche in pain management, but generated no particular excitement or controversy. Pharmaceutical companies had no reason to promote aggressive use, and regulators treated it like other Schedule II narcotics requiring careful controls. Through the 1950s, methadone remained a minor player in pain medicine, overshadowed by morphine's familiarity and newer semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone and hydromorphone. Nobody yet suspected the compound possessed unique properties that would revolutionize addiction treatment. The crucial discovery about methadone blocking other opioids from working wouldn't emerge from deliberate research, but from clinical observations that took years to recognize as significant. Doctors occasionally noticed that pain patients maintained on methadone didn't respond normally to morphine when given both drugs together. The methadone seemed to occupy opioid receptors so completely that morphine couldn't produce its typical effects, creating a competitive antagonism at the molecular level. These observations remained scattered case reports rather than systematic investigation, buried in medical literature that few researchers read carefully. The phenomenon seemed like a minor pharmacological curiosity, rather than the foundation for treating heroin addiction. Meanwhile, heroin had begun its post-war rise in American cities, concentrated initially in port communities and urban neighborhoods, with established drug trafficking networks. New York, San Francisco, Baltimore, and Los Angeles saw heroin availability increase throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. The drug arrived through organized crime channels controlled by American and Sicilian mafia families who had diversified from bootlegging during Prohibition into narcotics trafficking. Street heroin quality varied wildly, cut with anything from lactose to quinine to maximally lethal adulterants like strychnine. Users injected, snorted, or smoked the powder, chasing euphoria that lasted a few hours before withdrawal's agony began creeping back. Jazz musicians, merchant sailors, and urban poor formed the initial heroin-using populations, groups already marginalized enough that their addiction drew minimal public concern. The stereotype of the junkie emerged: criminal, immoral, probably non-white, deserving punishment rather than treatment. Medical institutions largely refused to treat heroin addiction, viewing it as a character defect rather than a medical condition. The 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act had effectively criminalized addiction treatment by restricting opioid prescribing, driving addicts into illegal markets, and preventing doctors from maintaining patients on legal opioids. This created a bizarre situation where morphine addiction from medical use received some sympathy, but heroin addiction from recreational use meant criminality and moral condemnation. The few doctors who tried treating heroin addicts in the 1950s had essentially no effective tools. Detoxification meant locking patients in psychiatric wards or jail cells to endure withdrawal, muscle cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, bone-deep pain, and psychological torment lasting days. Most patients relapsed immediately upon release, driven back to heroin by cravings and the relief it provided. Some physicians tried using morphine or other opioids to ease withdrawal, but this simply transferred dependence to a different drug without addressing the underlying addiction. The medical consensus held that abstinence was the only acceptable goal, despite relapse rates exceeding 90%. The concept of maintaining addicts on legal opioids indefinitely was considered enabling and immoral, something only weak doctors would consider. Heroin use climbed steadily through the 1950s despite aggressive law enforcement and harsh criminal penalties. The 1951 Boggs Act and 1956 Narcotics Control Act imposed mandatory minimum sentences that sent users to federal prison for years, but addiction rates continued rising. Communities watched helplessly as heroin destroyed families, created property crime waves, and killed users through overdoses or infections from dirty needles. The public health response remained almost entirely punitive. More arrests, more prosecutions, more imprisonment. Treatment programs that existed focused on moral rehabilitation through abstinence, psychotherapy, and religious conversion, approaches that failed catastrophically for most participants. Medical researchers studying addiction in the 1950s worked primarily with morphine rather than heroin, conducting experiments at facilities like the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. The Lexington facility housed both imprisoned addicts serving sentences and voluntary patients seeking treatment, creating an unethical research environment by modern standards. Scientists there documented addiction's physiological mechanisms, withdrawal symptoms, and relapse patterns, but developed no effective treatments. The prevailing theory held that addiction resulted from addictive personality disorders requiring psychiatric intervention, ignoring the neurochemical basis that later research would reveal. This psychological framework meant doctors looked for mental illness rather than metabolic disorders. Methadone sat on pharmacy shelves throughout this period, unused for addiction treatment because nobody had made the conceptual leap from pain management to opioid substitution therapy. The drug's long duration and receptor-blocking properties remained pharmaceutical trivia rather than recognized therapeutic advantages. Several factors needed to align before methadone's addiction treatment potential could be discovered. Researchers willing to challenge the abstinence-only orthodoxy, institutional support for controversial experiments, and patients desperate enough to try radical approaches. These elements would converge in early 1960s New York City, where heroin addiction had become an undeniable crisis, and two unconventional physicians prepared to violate medical taboos. The stage was set through convergent failures. Law enforcement couldn't arrest its way out of rising addiction rates. Psychiatry couldn't cure addicts through talk therapy and moral instruction. Abstinence programs couldn't prevent relapse in even their most motivated patients. Heroin kept spreading through American cities, creating visible populations of users who committed crimes, died young, and overwhelmed emergency rooms. The medical establishment's refusal to treat addiction as a chronic disease requiring ongoing management had created a catastrophe that conventional approaches couldn't solve. Into this failure walked two researchers who would rediscover what Nazi chemists had accidentally created, a drug that could hold heroin at bay indefinitely, not by curing addiction but by satisfying it with something less dangerous. Heroin consumption in New York City increased roughly 300% between 1950 and 1960, transforming the drug from a niche problem into a citywide crisis that politicians could no longer ignore. The Lower East Side, Harlem, and parts of Brooklyn developed open-air markets where dealers sold glassine envelopes stamped with brand names like Blue Magic and Dead on Arrival. Users congregated in shooting galleries, abandoned buildings where addicts shared needles, cooked heroin in bottle caps, and injected in communal squalor. Police conducted raids that accomplished nothing except cycling the same people through courts and jails, creating a revolving door that kept precincts busy without reducing addiction rates. The street price held steady around $5 per bag despite interdiction efforts, suggesting unlimited supply meeting growing demand. The typical user profile shifted disturbingly during the late 1950s as heroin spread beyond marginalized populations. White middle-class teenagers from Long Island and Westchester started appearing in emergency rooms with overdoses, shattering the comfortable myth that heroin only affected poor minorities. College students experimented with the drug at jazz clubs and beatnik gatherings, romanticizing its association with artistic rebellion. Young women became addicts at increasing rates, some through boyfriends who introduced them to the drug, others through their own curiosity about forbidden substances. Families discovered their children's addiction only after arrests or medical emergencies, facing a problem they had no framework to understand or address. The physiological reality of heroin dependence created users who needed the drug just to feel normal rather than to get high. After several weeks of regular use, the brain's opioid receptors adapted to constant heroin presence by reducing natural endorphin production and becoming less sensitive to stimulation. This neurochemical adjustment meant stopping heroin triggered catastrophic withdrawal, as the body suddenly lacked both external opioids and its own internal pain management system. Users described withdrawal as influenza multiplied by bone-breaking agony, with muscle spasms, projectile vomiting, and psychological desperation that drove them to commit crimes they would never otherwise consider. The 4 to 6 hour half-life of heroin meant addicts needed multiple daily doses to prevent withdrawal, creating a full-time job of finding money, locating dealers, and administering the drug. Criminal activity followed addiction with mathematical inevitability. A serious heroin habit cost $25 to $50 daily in 1950s money, roughly equivalent to a working-class weekly wage. Users pawned possessions first, then stole from family members, eventually graduating to burglary, robbery, and prostitution. Women with heroin addiction often turned to sex work as the most reliable income source, exposing themselves to violence, disease, and further exploitation. Male addicts formed criminal networks that operated like desperate corporations, planning burglaries and fencing stolen goods with ruthless efficiency. Police statistics showed property crime rates tracking precisely with heroin availability in specific neighborhoods, creating urban war zones where residents barricaded themselves behind multiple locks. Emergency rooms developed protocols for managing heroin overdoses as ambulances delivered dying users with blue lips and barely detectable breathing. Naloxone, an opioid antagonist that could reverse overdose within seconds, wouldn't become widely available until the 1970s. Instead, emergency physicians used rescue breathing, oxygen, and stimulants, watching patients either revive or die depending on how much heroin they had injected and how long ago. Successful resuscitations frequently resulted in patients fleeing the hospital against medical advice, terrified of police notification or desperate to avoid the withdrawal that naloxone would precipitate. The ones who died got identified through fingerprints or remained in morgue drawers labelled John Doe until space limitations required burial in Potter's Fields. Hepatitis infection rates among people who injected drugs reached epidemic proportions years before anyone understood the virus or its transmission mechanisms. Shared needles passed blood-borne pathogens efficiently, creating outbreaks of jaundice, liver failure, and chronic disease that medical personnel attributed vaguely to drug lifestyle without recognizing the specific infectious agent. Users injected with whatever needles they could obtain, often blunt, rusty eyedroppers attached to rubber bulbs, creating skin abscesses, bacterial endocarditis, and systemic infections that killed through sepsis. Hospitals treated these medical complications while refusing to address the underlying addiction, creating a system where users got antibiotics for infections, but no help staying off the drug that caused those infections. The federal government's response escalated enforcement while ignoring treatment, following the punitive logic that dominated drug policy since the 1914 Harrison Act. Harry Anslinger, who had directed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics since 1930, advocated for increasingly harsh penalties based on the theory that fear of punishment would deter drug use. The 1956 Narcotics Control Act that Anslinger championed imposed mandatory sentences including death penalty provisions for selling heroin to minors, creating penalties more severe than many murder statutes. Congress passed these laws with overwhelming bipartisan support, convinced that treating addicts with anything except punishment enabled their immoral choices. The concept of addiction as a brain disease requiring medical intervention existed in research literature but had zero influence on public policy. Physicians who attempted treating heroin addiction risked professional destruction under regulations that criminalized maintenance prescribing. The Supreme Court's 1919 decision in Webb v. United States had interpreted the Harrison Act to prohibit doctors from prescribing opioids to maintain addicts, even at stable doses that prevented withdrawal without causing intoxication. This ruling effectively made addiction treatment illegal, forcing the few doctors who cared about addicts to work in legal grey areas or abandon their patients entirely. Some physicians prescribed slowly decreasing doses to help users detoxify, but the relapse rate exceeded 90% as patients returned to heroin within days or weeks. The medical profession largely washed its hands of addiction treatment, viewing it as a criminal justice problem rather than a medical condition. Psychiatric approaches to addiction treatment during the 1950s relied on psychoanalytic theories that blamed inadequate parenting and unresolved childhood conflicts. Therapists conducted intensive talk therapy trying to uncover the emotional wounds that supposedly drove patients to seek chemical escape. These sessions occurred in psychiatric hospitals, where users detoxified through forced withdrawal, then participated in group therapy and individual counseling. The success rate approached zero. Patients sat through months of analysis discussing their relationships with their mothers, then relapsed immediately upon discharge when confronted with the neighborhoods, friends, and psychological triggers that had maintained their addiction. The psychiatric establishment blamed treatment failures on patient resistance and lack of motivation rather than questioning their theoretical framework. Religious and quasi-religious organizations offered the only alternatives to incarceration or futile psychiatric treatment. Synanon, founded in 1958 by a former alcoholic, created residential communities where addicts underwent brutal attack therapy sessions designed to break down their egos and rebuild them through cult-like social pressure. Participants lived in isolated facilities, subjected themselves to verbal abuse during group encounters, and remained for months or years in total immersion programs. Some claim this approach worked, though rigorous outcome studies were never conducted, and many participants described the experience as psychologically traumatic. Other programs based on religious conversion tried to replace drug use with spiritual devotion, achieving occasional success with highly motivated participants, but failing most others. The street reality for heroin users involved daily desperation punctuated by brief euphoria. An addict's morning began with withdrawal symptoms, sweating, nausea, muscle cramps, that intensified until the first dose of the day. Scoring heroin meant locating dealers who might have moved, been arrested, or sold out, requiring extensive searching through networks of other users, cooking the powder in a bottle cap with water and a cotton filter, drawing it into a makeshift syringe, then finding an accessible vein became ritualized obsessions performed in stairwells, public bathrooms, or shooting galleries. The injection brought instant relief from withdrawal, followed by a warm rush lasting perhaps 15 minutes, then a drowsy contentment that faded within hours. The cycle repeated 3 to 5 times daily, consuming all energy, money, and attention. Families experienced their loved one's heroin addiction as a kind of slow-motion death that destroyed everyone involved. Parents discovered their children stealing, lying, and manipulating with sociopathic efficiency as the drug rewired priorities and demolished moral restraints. Spouses watched partners transform from reliable companions into strangers who would sell wedding rings for another fix. Children grew up with parents who nodded off mid-conversation, forgot to provide food, or disappeared for days on drug binges. The social stigma prevented families from discussing these problems openly, creating isolation that intensified suffering. Support groups didn't exist. Treatment options were essentially unavailable, and the only advice from authorities involved tough love approaches that meant cutting off addicted family members completely. Overdose deaths climbed steadily, but received minimal public attention because victims came primarily from populations that mainstream society considered disposable. Jazz musicians and bohemian artists who died from heroin got romanticized as tragic geniuses, while poor Black and Puerto Rican users who died in tenements barely merited newspaper mentions. The heroin that killed them varied wildly in purity, sometimes containing barely any actual drug, and other times arriving at lethal concentrations that stopped breathing within minutes of injection. Users developed tolerance that allowed them to handle doses that would kill non-users, but this tolerance disappeared rapidly during even brief periods of abstinence. Ex-prisoners released after serving time for drug offences frequently died from overdose within days because they injected their usual dose with a tolerance level that had dropped during incarceration. Law enforcement statistics showed the futility of the enforcement approach, but politicians kept demanding more of the same. Arrests for narcotics violations increased every year, while addiction rates rose simultaneously, suggesting the criminal justice system was processing users without reducing heroin's availability or appeal. Prisons became de facto detoxification centres, where users underwent forced withdrawal in cells, suffered through the acute phase without medical supervision, then returned to the streets with criminal records that made legitimate employment nearly impossible. The recidivism rate approached 100% for heroin-related offences, as recently released users immediately resumed drug use to manage the psychological and social circumstances that had contributed to addiction initially. Medical researchers studying addiction in the early 1960s understood the neurochemical basis of dependence, but lacked any effective intervention beyond forced abstinence. They knew opioid receptors existed throughout the brain, and that heroin bound to these receptors with high affinity, triggering dopamine release and creating reinforcement loops that overwhelmed normal decision-making processes. They recognized that chronic use caused neuroadaptation requiring continued opioid presence to maintain homeostasis. They documented the agony of withdrawal and the near certainty of relapse, but translating this knowledge into treatment remained impossible under legal frameworks that criminalize the most obvious medical intervention, maintaining addicts on legal opioids at stable doses that prevented withdrawal without causing dangerous intoxication. The heroin crisis of the early 1960s existed in plain sight, while remaining simultaneously invisible through deliberate political and social neglect. Everyone knew addiction was destroying communities, but nobody with power or resources treated it as a solvable problem requiring medical intervention. The dominant narrative blamed users for moral failure, while ignoring the physiological reality that made quitting heroin nearly impossible through willpower alone. This contradiction would persist until researchers willing to challenge orthodoxy and risk professional consequences decided that watching thousands die was worse than violating the abstinence-only consensus. The tools to address heroin addiction were already sitting on pharmacy shelves, synthesized decades earlier by Nazi chemists who never imagined their battlefield painkiller could treat the exact problem America refused to acknowledge as medical. Dr. Vincent Dole spent his career studying metabolism at Rockefeller University, researching obesity, diabetes, and how bodies process nutrients, never intending to become controversial. His laboratory focused on biochemical pathways and cellular energy production, respectable topics that earned grants and publications without threatening anyone's ideology. In 1963, at age 50, Dole encountered Dr. Marie Niswander at a medical conference where she presented research on heroin addiction that contradicted everything the psychiatric establishment believed. Niswander had worked directly with addicts for over a decade, first as a public health service physician at the Lexington Narcotics Hospital, then in private practice treating patients that other doctors refused to see. She described addiction not as personality disorder or moral weakness, but as a metabolic disease that hijacked normal physiological processes. Niswander's clinical experience had taught her that conventional addiction treatment failed because it ignored biology in favor of psychology. She had watched hundreds of patients endure detoxification, participate in therapy, express sincere motivation to stay clean, then relapse within days or weeks of leaving controlled environments. The psychiatric explanations, weak ego strength, unresolved conflicts, inadequate motivation, didn't match what she observed in intelligent, motivated patients who genuinely wanted to quit but couldn't maintain abstinence despite every advantage. Their brains had been fundamentally altered by chronic opioid exposure, creating a physiological need that willpower couldn't overcome. Treating this with psychoanalysis made as much sense as treating diabetes with talk therapy instead of insulin. Dole found her arguments compelling because they aligned with his understanding of metabolic disorders as chronic conditions requiring ongoing management rather than one-time cures. Diabetics needed insulin replacement indefinitely because their pancreases couldn't produce it naturally. Perhaps heroin addicts needed opioid replacement because their brains could no longer function normally without it. This reasoning violated the sacred principle that addiction treatment must aim for abstinence, but Dole approached the problem as a metabolism researcher rather than an addiction specialist bound by field orthodoxy. He proposed they collaborate on investigating whether heroin addiction represented a metabolic disorder, treatable through biochemical intervention rather than psychiatric rehabilitation. The collaboration began with Niswander describing street-level realities that Dole had never encountered in academic research. Addicts injected heroin multiple times daily not to get high, but to prevent withdrawal, creating an exhausting cycle that consumed all resources and attention. The 4 to 6 hour duration of heroin's effects meant users needed constant redosing, making normal employment or family life impossible. Withdrawal symptoms appeared predictably as blood levels dropped, driving behavior with more urgency than hunger or thirst. If they could find an opioid with longer duration that prevented withdrawal without causing euphoric intoxication, users might stabilize and resume functional lives. The drug would need oral administration to avoid injection rituals, slow onset to prevent rushes, and extended action to enable once-daily dosing. Methadone emerged from their literature review almost immediately as the only existing compound with these properties. Dole knew it from pain management applications, but had never considered its addiction treatment potential. Nystwander recognized that its long duration could maintain opioid levels in the bloodstream continuously, preventing the peaks and valleys that characterized heroin use. The pharmaceutical data showed methadone occupied opioid receptors for 24 to 36 hours, far longer than morphine or heroin. Animal studies suggested it produced tolerance to its own euphoric effects quickly while maintaining analgesic properties, meaning patients might stabilize at doses that prevented withdrawal without causing intoxication. Most intriguingly, methadone appeared to block other opioids from working through competitive receptor binding. This blocking property became the theoretical foundation for their approach. If methadone occupied opioid receptors so completely that heroin couldn't bind effectively, users maintained on methadone might not experience heroin's euphoric effects even if they injected it. This could break the reinforcement cycle that maintained addiction by eliminating the reward from heroin use. The concept seemed almost too elegant. Replace a short-acting street drug administered by injection with a long-acting pharmaceutical taken orally, preventing withdrawal while blocking the high from continued heroin use. Whether this would work in actual human addicts remained completely unknown, but the biological logic appeared sound enough to warrant investigation. Obtaining approval for their research required navigating regulatory and institutional barriers designed to prevent exactly what they proposed. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics opposed any form of opioid maintenance as enabling addiction, and New York state law prohibited prescribing narcotics to maintain addicts except in extremely limited circumstances. Rockefeller University's administration worried about reputational damage from conducting addiction research, a field associated with criminals and moral degenerates rather than serious science. Dole and Nyswander spent months developing protocols that addressed every conceivable objection, emphasizing rigorous research methodology and careful patient selection. They positioned the work as basic metabolic research, rather than controversial addiction treatment, though everyone understood the implications. Manhattan General Hospital agreed to host the initial trial in late 1963, providing beds for inpatient observation and medical backup if anything went wrong. Dole and Nyswander designed a conservative protocol starting with 2 patients who would receive gradually increasing methadone doses while completely isolated from heroin access. The researchers would monitor vital signs, blood chemistry, behavior, and subjective reports continuously, documenting everything for the inevitable scrutiny. Patient selection criteria were restrictive. Multiple failed treatment attempts, long addiction history, medical stability, and willingness to participate in experimental research with unknown outcomes. The legal vulnerabilities terrified institutional lawyers who drafted consent forms longer than most medical procedures required. The first patient admitted to the methadone research ward in January 1964 had been addicted to heroin for over a decade, cycling through detoxification programs, psychiatric treatment, and prison without achieving lasting abstinence. He entered the hospital in withdrawal, experiencing the muscle aches and anxiety that preceded full-blown symptoms. Nyswander administered the initial methadone dose orally as a liquid solution, starting conservatively at 10 milligrams twice daily. The patient reported withdrawal symptoms subsiding within hours, replaced by a sense of calm stability without euphoria or sedation. His vital signs remained normal. He conversed coherently, and he showed no signs of intoxication despite receiving an opioid. Over the following week, doses increased gradually to find the level that eliminated withdrawal completely while maintaining functionality. By day 10, the patient stabilized at 100 milligrams daily, a dose that kept him comfortable for 24 hours without producing any high. He ate regular meals, slept normally, participated in occupational therapy, and behaved nothing like the stereotypical junkie, unable to function without constant heroin. The methadone appeared to satisfy his brain's opioid requirement while allowing normal cognition and behavior. Most remarkably, he reported that heroin cravings had diminished significantly, suggesting the methadone was addressing the neurochemical imbalance driving his addiction. The second patient, admitted 2 weeks later, showed similar results with slightly different dosing requirements. Both patients remained in the hospital for several months, while researchers documented their metabolic and psychological status exhaustively. The breakthrough moment came when Dole and Niswander tested methadone's blocking properties by giving patients heroin under controlled conditions. With informed consent, they administered pharmaceutical-grade heroin to both patients after they had stabilized on methadone maintenance. Neither patient reported the typical euphoric rush or dreamy intoxication that heroin normally produced. The methadone had saturated their opioid receptors so completely that heroin couldn't displace it or create additional effects. This finding suggested that patients maintained on adequate methadone doses wouldn't benefit from using street heroin, potentially eliminating the motivation for continued illicit drug use. The practical implications were staggering. A treatment that simultaneously prevented withdrawal and blocked heroin's rewarding effects. The researchers expanded their study cautiously, adding 4 more patients in mid-1964 with similarly encouraging results. All 6 patients stabilized on methadone doses between 80 and 120 milligrams daily, showing dramatic improvements in behavior, cognition, and social functioning. They participated in group therapy, educational programs, and vocational training while maintained on the medication. Several found part-time employment while still hospitalized, something utterly impossible during active heroin addiction. Medical monitoring revealed no significant adverse effects from chronic methadone administration beyond constipation and mild sweating. Blood tests showed normal liver and kidney function despite months of daily opioid exposure. The medication appeared remarkably safe for long-term use. The question of discharge and community reintegration emerged as patients stabilized and wanted to leave the hospital. Dole and Niswander recognized that maintaining patients on methadone indefinitely violated every principle of conventional addiction treatment, which insisted that complete abstinence from all opioids was the only acceptable goal. However, their clinical observation suggested that these patients remained physiologically dependent on methadone and would experience severe withdrawal if medication stopped. The metabolic disorder hypothesis predicted that addiction had caused permanent neuroadaptations requiring ongoing opioid replacement, similar to how diabetes requires lifelong insulin. Attempting to taper patients off methadone would likely result in immediate relapse to heroin use. They made the controversial decision to continue methadone indefinitely, while transitioning patients to outpatient status. This created logistical challenges since patients needed daily medication to prevent withdrawal but couldn't be trusted with take-home supplies that might be diverted to street sale. The solution involved requiring daily clinic attendance for observed dosing, creating a treatment model that balanced medication access with accountability. Patients would come to the clinic every morning, drink their methadone dose under staff supervision, then leave to attend work, school, or other activities. This structure provided both the medication needed to maintain stability and the monitoring needed to prevent diversion. The first patient discharged from the hospital to outpatient methadone maintenance in June 1964 represented a landmark moment that conventional addiction medicine said was impossible. He returned to his family, found employment as a factory worker, and attended the clinic daily for his methadone dose. Urine testing confirmed he remained abstinent from heroin despite living in the same neighborhood where he had previously bought drugs. His criminal activity ceased completely, his health improved, and his family relationships normalized. The researchers documented his progress meticulously, knowing that skeptics would dismiss any positive outcome as temporary or fabricated. 3 months later, he remained stable and functional, living a life that had been unattainable during years of heroin addiction. The other patients followed similar patterns as they transitioned to outpatient treatment through late 1964 and early 1965. The results were consistent enough to constitute genuine scientific findings rather than anecdotal success stories. Patients maintained on methadone stopped using heroin, reduced criminal behavior to near zero, found employment at rates comparable to the general population, and showed psychological stability that contradicted theories about addictive personalities requiring intensive therapy. The medication appeared to be doing exactly what Dole and Niswander hypothesized, correcting a metabolic imbalance that made normal functioning impossible without opioid replacement. The implications threatened to overturn decades of addiction treatment, orthodoxy based on abstinence as the only legitimate goal. The medical establishment reacted to Dole and Niswander's initial results with suspicion bordering on hostility, viewing methadone maintenance as philosophically unacceptable, regardless of clinical outcomes. The American Medical Association's Council on Mental Health issued statements in 1965 questioning whether substituting one opioid for another constituted legitimate treatment or merely transferred addiction from an illegal drug to a legal one. Psychiatric organizations argued that maintaining patients on any opioid prevented them from confronting the underlying psychological issues driving their addiction, essentially enabling avoidance rather than promoting healing. The abstinence-only orthodoxy ran so deep that many physicians refused to even examine Dole and Niswander's data, dismissing it on ideological grounds before considering the evidence. Law enforcement opposition proved even more intractable than medical resistance. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, still operating under philosophical assumptions established by Harry Anslinger decades earlier, viewed methadone maintenance as surrendering to addiction rather than fighting it. Regional narcotics officers argued that providing legal opioids to addicts would increase drug dependency rather than reducing it, creating government-sponsored addiction that taxpayers would fund indefinitely. Police departments worried that methadone clinics would attract criminals and drug dealers to neighborhoods, becoming magnets for the very populations that law enforcement wanted to disperse or incarcerate. The concept of treating addiction as a medical condition rather than a criminal behavior threatened the entire enforcement apparatus built around narcotics prohibition. Dole and Niswander responded by publishing their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1965, documenting outcomes for their first 22 patients with rigorous scientific methodology. The data showed that 88% remained in treatment after 6 months, 94% stopped using heroin based on urine testing, and 75% found employment or returned to school. Crime rates among participants dropped to essentially zero, with only one arrest during the entire study period compared to the multiple annual arrests that had characterized their pre-treatment lives. The researchers presented this evidence without inflammatory rhetoric, letting the clinical outcomes speak to methadone's effectiveness in ways that theoretical arguments couldn't match. The publication triggered fierce debate in medical journals throughout 1965 and 1966, with critics attacking everything from research methodology to ethical implications. Some physicians argued that the study sample was too small and carefully selected to represent typical heroin addicts, suggesting results wouldn't replicate in broader populations. Others questioned whether 6-month outcomes predicted long-term success, noting that many addiction treatments showed initial promise before failing over extended periods. The most fundamental criticism targeted the concept of indefinite maintenance itself. Even if methadone kept patients functional, they remained physiologically dependent on opioids with no plan for ever achieving complete abstinence. This violated the deeply held conviction that addiction treatment must ultimately restore patients to drug-free status. Nieswander countered these arguments by drawing analogies to other chronic diseases requiring lifelong medication. Nobody criticized diabetics for remaining dependent on insulin indefinitely, or hypertensive patients for taking blood pressure medications permanently, because these treatments addressed underlying physiological disorders that couldn't be cured through willpower or psychological intervention. Heroin addiction appeared to cause similar permanent neuroadaptations, creating a metabolic disorder where the brain's opioid systems no longer function normally without external opioid replacement. Methadone maintenance treated this disorder the same way insulin treated diabetes, by providing the substance the body could no longer produce adequately on its own. This metabolic disorder framework threatened addiction treatment professionals whose entire careers were built on abstinence-based approaches. Therapeutic communities like Synanon, religious recovery programs, and psychiatric treatment centers all depended on the premise that addiction represented a curable condition requiring behavioral change and moral reformation. If addiction was actually a chronic brain disease requiring permanent medication, these approaches were fundamentally misguided, and their success rates, already dismally low, looked even worse. The financial and professional interests aligned against methadone maintenance extended far beyond principled disagreement about treatment philosophy. Political pressure began building in 1966 as urban politicians, desperate for solutions to rising crime rates, took interest in methadone's potential. New York City Mayor John Lindsay faced a heroin crisis that had overwhelmed police, courts, and hospitals while generating public fear about street crime and neighborhood deterioration. The possibility of a medical intervention that reduced crime dramatically, while costing relatively little compared to incarceration, appealed to officials seeking practical solutions regardless of ideological purity. Lindsay's administration began exploring how to expand methadone treatment beyond Rockefeller University's small research program into a citywide public health initiative. Federal officials in the nascent Johnson administration's war on poverty also recognized methadone's potential despite opposition from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The Office of Economic Opportunity funded demonstration projects in several cities, betting that reducing heroin addiction could break cycles of poverty, unemployment, and criminal justice involvement that trapped urban populations. These political developments created strange alliances between liberal public health advocates, tough-on-crime conservatives, and pragmatic city managers who all saw methadone as serving their different agendas. The treatment's effectiveness at reducing visible street crime gave it appeal across ideological divides that purely medical arguments couldn't achieve. Dole and Nieswander expanded their program carefully through 1966 and 1967, enrolling more patients while documenting outcomes that consistently replicated their initial findings. By mid-1967, they had treated over 200 patients with retention rates exceeding 80%, and continued dramatic reductions in heroin use and criminal activity. The researchers published follow-up studies showing that benefits persisted beyond 1 year, addressing concerns about temporary effects. They also refined their clinical protocols based on experience. Optimal doses range from 80 to 120 milligrams for most patients. Daily observed dosing prevented diversion, and comprehensive services including counseling and employment assistance improved outcomes beyond medication alone. The expansion revealed practical challenges that small-scale research hadn't encountered. Some patients continued using heroin occasionally despite methadone maintenance, particularly those with co-occurring psychiatric conditions or ongoing exposure to drug-using social networks. Others struggled with methadone side effects, primarily constipation and excessive sweating, which, while not dangerous, proved uncomfortable enough to reduce quality of life. A few patients sold their methadone doses on the black market, creating diversion problems that fueled law enforcement concerns about maintaining addicts on legal opioids. These complications didn't undermine methadone's overall effectiveness, but demonstrated that it wasn't a miracle cure working universally for all patients. The question of who should control methadone treatment created jurisdictional battles between medical authorities, public health departments, and law enforcement agencies. Physicians argued that treating addiction was fundamentally medical practice, requiring clinical judgment and doctor-patient relationships. Public health officials countered that an epidemic affecting thousands required population-level interventions with standardized protocols rather than individualized care. Police and prosecutors wanted strict oversight to prevent diversion and ensure that treatment didn't become a cover for continued drug use. These competing interests shaped regulations that treated methadone maintenance as simultaneously medical treatment, public health intervention, and law enforcement concern. The Nixon administration, which took office in 1969 facing urban unrest, partly fueled by heroin-related crime, embraced methadone maintenance for purely pragmatic reasons. Nixon's political strategy required demonstrating that Republican governance could restore order to cities spinning into chaos, and reducing street crime through medical treatment served this goal effectively. The president's advisors recognized that methadone cost roughly $2,000 annually per patient compared to $30,000 for incarceration, creating fiscal arguments that appealed to conservative budget concerns. Nixon authorized federal funding for methadone programs in 1970, despite personal distaste for anything that seemed to enable drug use. The Food and Drug Administration approved methadone for maintenance treatment in 1971, but the approval came with unprecedented restrictions, reflecting ongoing distrust of addiction treatment. Clinics required special licensing separate from normal medical practice. Patients had to attend daily for observed dosing with limited take-home privileges, and programs needed extensive documentation and oversight that exceeded requirements for any other medication. The regulations essentially created a parallel medical system specifically for methadone, with rules designed more to prevent diversion and abuse than to optimize patient care. These restrictions would shape methadone treatment for decades, creating barriers that limited access and reinforced the stigma around both the medication and the patients receiving it. Methadone programs proliferated rapidly between 1971 and 1973, as federal and state funding flowed to cities desperate to address heroin epidemics. Clinics opened in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of smaller cities, serving thousands of patients who had never had access to effective addiction treatment. The expansion happened faster than workforce training could accommodate, creating programs run by staff with minimal expertise in addiction medicine or opioid pharmacology. Some clinics operated more like criminal justice monitoring stations than medical facilities, treating patients as suspects who needed surveillance rather than people with chronic diseases requiring compassionate care. The quality variation between well-run programs following Dole and Niswander's model and poorly managed clinics became enormous. Success stories emerged from programs that implemented methadone maintenance as comprehensive medical treatment with adequate doses, supportive services, and respectful patient care. Former heroin addicts who had spent decades cycling through jails and hospitals stabilized on methadone, found employment, reunited with families, and lived productive lives indistinguishable from the general population. Some went years without using heroin, maintained stable housing, raised children, and contributed to their communities in ways that had been impossible during active addiction. These outcomes validated Dole and Niswander's theory that addiction represented a treatable metabolic disorder rather than an untreatable moral failing. failures occurred just as visibly at clinics that treated methadone as a chemical straitjacket rather than medical treatment. Programs that kept doses deliberately low to avoid over-medication left patients in constant low-grade withdrawal, driving them back to heroin for relief. Clinics that imposed punitive rules discharged patients for minor infractions, abandoning them to likely overdose death. Staff who viewed patients with contempt created hostile environments where people felt degraded rather than supported. The daily observed dosing requirement, while preventing diversion, also created scheduling demands that cost patients jobs when clinic hours conflicted with employment. These program failures generated headlines and political backlash that overshadowed the quiet successes. The medical community remained deeply divided about methadone maintenance through the 1970s, with some physicians embracing it as evidence-based treatment, while others condemned it as pharmaceutical enabling. Academic medical centers generally supported methadone based on research evidence, while community physicians often refused to participate in programs they viewed as morally questionable. The American Society of Addiction Medicine formed partly in response to these debates, creating professional standards that attempted to define appropriate methadone use. The Society's guidelines endorsed maintenance treatment, while emphasizing that it should include counseling, case management, and eventual tapering toward abstinence, a compromise position that satisfied neither harm reduction advocates nor abstinence purists. By 1973, roughly 75,000 Americans were receiving methadone maintenance treatment, a dramatic expansion from Dolan Niswander's initial 6 patients just 9 years earlier. The treatment had achieved mainstream acceptance despite never fully overcoming the philosophical objections that greeted its introduction. Methadone occupied an uncomfortable position in American medicine, proven effective by rigorous research yet stigmatized by association with addiction, widely available yet heavily restricted, life-saving for many patients yet controversial among treatment providers. The drug that Nazi chemists created to solve a wartime morphine shortage had become America's primary medical response to heroin addiction, saving lives while generating ongoing debates about whether saving addicts through indefinite opioid replacement constituted legitimate medicine or ideological surrender. The rapid expansion of methadone programs between 1971 and 1975 created treatment infrastructure without adequate quality controls, transforming a carefully researched medical intervention into an industrial-scale operation prone to abuse and neglect. Clinics opened in storefronts, church basements, and converted warehouses, operated by organizations ranging from university hospitals to for-profit corporations with minimal addiction medicine expertise. Some programs enrolled hundreds of patients with just 2 or 3 staff members, making individualized care impossible and reducing treatment to assembly line medication dispensing. Patients lined up each morning outside clinics in visible queues that advertised their addiction status to neighbors and potential employers, destroying any privacy about their medical treatment. The daily observed dosing requirement that prevented diversion also created logistical nightmares for patients trying to rebuild their lives. Clinics typically operated from 5:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. to accommodate patients before work, but this schedule assumed stable employment with predictable hours. Construction workers who traveled to different job sites, service industry employees with variable shifts, and anyone whose employment required early morning presence found clinic attendance incompatible with keeping jobs. The rules prohibited missing doses, so patients chose between treatment and employment, a cruel dilemma that undermined methadone's goal of enabling normal social functioning. Many clinics showed no flexibility, treating schedule conflicts as patient failures rather than program design flaws. Take-home privileges that would have solved scheduling problems remained severely restricted by regulations that assumed all patients would divert medication if given the opportunity. Federal guidelines limited take-homes to patients who had demonstrated months or years of stability, clean urine tests, and perfect compliance with clinic rules. Earning a single take-home bottle for Sundays required 90 days of flawless behaviour. Earning a week's supply might take 2 years of continued compliance. These restrictions treated methadone patients far more suspiciously than diabetics receiving insulin or cardiac patients prescribed powerful medications, reflecting the lingering belief that addiction resulted from moral weakness, requiring strict supervision rather than a medical condition deserving trust and dignity. The authoritarian atmosphere at many clinics combined medical treatment with criminal justice surveillance in ways that humiliated patients and reinforced their outsider status. Staff conducted observed urination for drug testing, watching patients produce urine samples to prevent substitution or adulteration. Counselors interrogated patients about their activities, associates, and behavior with attitudes ranging from therapeutic concern to open hostility. Some programs required patients to attend group therapy sessions where they confessed drug use and personal failings in front of strangers, mimicking therapeutic communities' confrontational approaches. Despite lacking evidence this benefited methadone patients, the message conveyed was clear: you're not trusted, you're not respectable, you're being managed rather than treated. Methadone diversion to black markets emerged inevitably as some patients sold their doses to buy heroin, obtain other drugs, or simply survive financially. A patient receiving 100 milligrams daily could sell half the dose for $10 to $20 while taking enough to avoid withdrawal, creating income in an economy that often refused to employ known addicts. Street methadone appealed to heroin users who couldn't access treatment programs, needed something to prevent withdrawal between heroin doses, or wanted a legal alternative they could use without clinic supervision. The diversion created a secondary problem where non-patients obtained methadone without medical oversight, sometimes with tragic consequences. Deaths from methadone among non-tolerant individuals sparked media scandals that overshadowed the lives saved through proper medical use. A heroin user who occasionally obtained methadone might take 40 to 60 milligrams, not understanding that the drug's delayed onset meant effects appeared hours after ingestion. Feeling minimal effects initially, they would take more methadone or add heroin, then experience severe respiratory depression 6 to 8 hours later as peak levels accumulated. Unlike heroin overdoses that killed within minutes, methadone overdoses developed slowly, with victims losing consciousness gradually and dying in their sleep from breathing that slowed until it stopped completely. These deaths occurred in bedrooms and apartments where nobody noticed until morning revealed a corpse. The most horrifying methadone deaths involved children who accidentally ingested take-home doses left accessible by careless parents. A brightly coloured liquid in an unmarked bottle looked like fruit juice to a toddler who drank it and died hours later from respiratory depression. These tragedies generated intense media coverage and political outrage, with news stories featuring grieving grandparents and prosecutors demanding accountability. The coverage rarely mentioned that such accidents resulted from inadequate take-home bottle safety measures and insufficient patient education rather than inherent medication dangers. Every child death triggered regulatory crackdowns that further restricted take-home privileges for all patients, punishing thousands for individual failures. Public perception shifted during the mid-1970s as methadone transformed from promising treatment to another drug problem requiring management and control. Television news showed clinic lines filled with disheveled people, interviewed neighbors complaining about addicts congregating in their communities, and featured law enforcement officials describing diversion operations. The narrative emphasized methadone's potential for abuse, while downplaying its effectiveness at reducing heroin use, criminal behavior, and overdose deaths. Programs that quietly served thousands of patients effectively received no media attention, while every clinic scandal, diversion case, or accidental death generated headlines that reinforced negative stereotypes. The regulatory response to diversion and deaths involved layering additional restrictions onto already heavily regulated programs rather than improving quality or expanding access to reduce black market demand. Federal regulations in 1973 tightened take-home criteria, increased documentation requirements, and mandated more frequent urine testing. States added their own rules requiring specific counseling hours, limiting clinic locations, and restricting which medical professionals could prescribe methadone. The cumulative effect created a treatment system so bureaucratically burdensome that opening new clinics or improving existing ones became prohibitively difficult. Well-intentioned regulations designed to prevent harm instead limited treatment availability and quality. Patients who thrived on methadone maintenance remained invisible, despite numbering in the tens of thousands by the mid-1970s. A former heroin addict who stabilized on methadone, worked steadily, raised children, and lived conventionally had every incentive to hide their treatment status from employers, neighbors, and even extended family. The stigma associated with methadone often exceeded that of past heroin use, since active treatment meant ongoing addiction rather than recovery narrative that society preferred. Successful patients stayed silent, leaving public discourse dominated by program failures and scandals that suggested methadone created more problems than it solved. The HIV/AIDS epidemic beginning in the early 1980s revealed an unintended but crucial benefit of methadone maintenance that would eventually save hundreds of thousands of lives. Heroin users who injected drugs shared needles extensively, creating perfect conditions for blood-borne virus transmission. HIV spread through injection drug user populations with horrifying efficiency between 1981 and 1985, particularly in New York, San Francisco, and other cities with large heroin-using communities. Addicts who continued injecting heroin faced HIV infection rates approaching 50% in some neighborhoods, creating an epidemic within an epidemic. Methadone patients who stopped injecting drugs or reduced injection frequency had dramatically lower HIV infection rates compared to active heroin users. The oral medication eliminated the need for needles and the rush-seeking behavior that encouraged sharing injection equipment. Research in the late 1980s documented this protective effect clearly. Communities with robust methadone programs showed significantly lower HIV prevalence among drug users than communities with limited treatment access. This finding reframed methadone's value from treating individual addiction to preventing infectious disease transmission, creating new public health arguments for expanding treatment even among skeptics who dismissed addiction medicine's validity. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s complicated methadone treatment as patients began using stimulants alongside their maintenance medication. Cocaine and crack didn't activate opioid receptors, so methadone provided no blocking effect or deterrent against their use. Patients maintained on adequate methadone doses who remained abstinent from heroin nonetheless started smoking crack, creating a dual problem that treatment programs weren't designed to address. Urine tests revealed widespread cocaine use among methadone patients, triggering debates about whether programs should discharge users who violated rules against any illicit drug use. Some clinics adopted zero-tolerance policies that expelled patients for cocaine-positive tests, while others recognized that forcing cocaine-using patients off methadone would drive them back to heroin as well. Medical research during the 1980s finally began documenting methadone's long-term safety profile, finding that patients could remain on stable doses for decades without significant health consequences. Studies followed patients for 10 to 20 years, measuring liver function, kidney health, cognitive abilities, and overall mortality. The findings contradicted fears about chronic opioid exposure causing organ damage or mental impairment. Properly maintained patients showed normal health markers comparable to the general population. Their mortality rates remained elevated compared to never addicted individuals, but dropped dramatically compared to active heroin users who died from overdoses, infections, violence, and other addiction-related causes at rates 10 to 20 times higher than the general population. The evidence base supporting methadone maintenance became overwhelming by the late 1980s, with dozens of studies demonstrating reduced heroin use, decreased criminal activity, improved employment, better health outcomes, and lower mortality. The research quality exceeded most medical interventions, with long-term follow-up and rigorous methodology that left little doubt about effectiveness. Yet public policy and clinical practice lagged far behind the evidence, constrained by regulations, stigma, and persistent ideological opposition. Treatment remained difficult to access, heavily restricted, and often delivered in conditions that degraded patients rather than supporting their recovery. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 should have protected methadone patients from discrimination, since addiction treatment theoretically qualified as disability accommodation. However, courts carved out exceptions that allowed employers to refuse hiring anyone in addiction treatment, landlords to deny housing to methadone patients, and professional licensing boards to reject applicants receiving opioid replacement therapy. These legal discriminations meant that patients faced ongoing barriers to employment, housing, and professional advancement regardless of their stability and functionality. The law recognized addiction as a disability deserving protection in theory, while permitting discrimination in practice. Some patients remained on methadone maintenance for 30 or 40 years, essentially lifetime treatment that managed their opioid dependence the way insulin manages diabetes. They built careers, raised families, and contributed to society, while dependent on daily medication that prevented the addiction from destroying their lives. Others attempted to taper off methadone after years of stability, seeking the complete abstinence that society valorized as true recovery. The success rate for voluntary methadone cessation remained discouragingly low. Studies suggested that 50 to 70% relapsed to heroin within a year of stopping methadone. Those who succeeded often did so only after many years of stability and with extensive psychosocial support. The paradox of methadone by 1990 was complete. Overwhelming evidence supported its effectiveness, yet access remained limited and highly stigmatized. The medication saved lives and reduced crime at costs far below incarceration or hospital care, yet expanded slowly and faced constant political opposition. Patients who benefited stayed silent about their treatment, while those who struggled received disproportionate attention. The drug created by Nazi chemists for battlefield pain had become America's primary addiction treatment. Rejected by purists who viewed any opioid use as failure, while embraced by pragmatists who recognized that imperfect survival exceeded ideologically pure death. The battle over methadone's legitimacy would continue for decades, with lives hanging in the balance while ideologues debated whether keeping addicts alive with substitute opioids constituted medical progress or moral surrender. The prescription opioid epidemic that began exploding in the late 1990s created a bitter irony for methadone. The same medical system that had restricted its use for heroin addiction now prescribed similar opioids with reckless abandon for pain management. OxyContin, introduced by Purdue Pharma in 1996, flooded American communities through aggressive marketing that downplayed addiction risks while promoting long-acting opioid therapy for chronic pain. Doctors who had been taught to view opioid maintenance for addiction as ethically questionable freely prescribed months of potent painkillers for back pain, dental work, and minor injuries. The pharmaceutical industry had succeeded where methadone advocates failed, normalizing long-term opioid use by reframing it as pain treatment rather than addiction management. By 2010, prescription opioid overdoses were killing roughly 16,000 Americans annually, dwarfing heroin deaths and creating an addiction crisis in suburban and rural communities that had previously viewed opioids as inner-city problems affecting other people. Patients who became dependent on prescribed painkillers faced the same neurochemical dependence that heroin created, experiencing identical withdrawal symptoms when prescriptions ended or doctors suddenly cut them off. Many transitioned to heroin because street drugs cost less than diverted prescription pills, reversing the historical pattern where heroin users represented a distinct population from medical opioid users. The epidemic demonstrated what methadone researchers had argued for decades. Opioid dependence was a physiological condition, independent of how people initially encountered the drugs. Methadone's role shifted as physicians increasingly prescribed it for chronic pain rather than addiction, taking advantage of its long duration and low cost compared to branded painkillers. Insurance companies preferred methadone because generic versions cost pennies per dose versus dollars for OxyContin or other brand-name opioids. Pain management clinics distributed methadone in quantities that would have been unthinkable for addiction treatment, sending patients home with months of take-home supplies. The double standard became absurd. Addiction patients attending specialized clinics under strict oversight received tightly controlled doses, while pain patients picked up 100-tablet bottles from regular pharmacies with minimal monitoring. This pain management methadone prescribing created new overdose problems, as patients and doctors unfamiliar with its pharmacology made fatal dosing errors. The delayed onset and long half-life that made methadone ideal for once-daily addiction treatment became deadly when pain doctors prescribed it like short-acting opioids with multiple daily doses. Patients experiencing breakthrough pain would take extra methadone, not understanding that effects accumulated over days rather than hours. Methadone deaths among pain patients increased dramatically between 2000 and 2008, with the CDC reporting that the drug accounted for roughly 1/3 of prescription opioid overdoses, despite representing only 2% of prescriptions. The medication's reputation suffered as news coverage blamed methadone itself rather than inappropriate prescribing practices. The FDA responded in 2006 with warnings about methadone's cardiac effects, specifically QT interval prolongation that could cause fatal arrhythmias. High doses or rapid increases could disrupt the heart's electrical rhythm, triggering sudden death even without respiratory depression. This risk had been recognized in addiction treatment for years, managed through careful dose escalation and EKG monitoring for high-dose patients. Pain management prescribing often ignored these precautions, creating preventable deaths that generated regulatory actions limiting methadone's use for pain. The restrictions barely affected addiction treatment, which already operated under separate regulatory frameworks, but reduced pain management prescribing significantly. Buprenorphine emerged in 2002 as methadone's first real competitor for opioid addiction treatment, offering a different pharmacological approach with less regulatory burden. The Drug Addiction Treatment Act allowed certified physicians to prescribe buprenorphine from regular medical offices rather than specialized clinics, eliminating daily attendance requirements that made methadone treatment so burdensome. Buprenorphine was a partial opioid agonist rather than a full agonist like methadone, meaning it activated receptors less completely and had a ceiling effect that limited overdose potential. The medication could be prescribed in monthly supplies for home use, enabling patients to receive treatment with privacy and convenience impossible under methadone's clinic-based model. The medical establishment embraced buprenorphine with enthusiasm it had never shown for methadone, partly because the newer medication lacked methadone's association with controversial clinic-based programs and their stigmatized patient populations. Physicians felt comfortable prescribing buprenorphine to suburban patients who'd become addicted to prescription painkillers, viewing them as different from the stereotypical urban heroin users who attended methadone clinics. This distinction was entirely artificial. Both groups suffered from opioid use disorder with identical neurochemistry, but it influenced treatment access and quality profoundly. Insurance companies covered buprenorphine more readily than methadone treatment, and patients could obtain it without the public exposure that clinic attendance required. Methadone remained superior for many patients despite buprenorphine's advantages, particularly those with severe, long-standing heroin addiction. Buprenorphine's partial agonist properties meant it couldn't fully satisfy opioid receptors in highly dependent individuals, leaving them in low-grade withdrawal that drove them back to heroin. Methadone's full agonist action provided complete receptor saturation, eliminating withdrawal and cravings more effectively for these patients. Clinical trials showed roughly equal outcomes for both medications in general populations, but methadone consistently outperformed buprenorphine for patients with heavy prior opioid use. The medication served different patient needs, yet ideological preferences for buprenorphine's office-based model led to inadequate methadone access in many communities. The heroin supply itself changed dramatically after 2010 as Mexican cartels began distributing black tar and powder heroin more widely, while simultaneously introducing illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid roughly 50 times more potent than heroin, increasingly contaminated street drug supplies either as an adulterant or complete heroin substitute. Users seeking heroin unknowingly injected fentanyl, experiencing overdoses from doses that would have been survivable with actual heroin. Overdose death rates exploded, rising from roughly 8,000 heroin deaths in 2010 to over 15,000 in 2015, then accelerating further as fentanyl analogues even more potent than fentanyl itself appeared in street supplies. Methadone's blocking properties proved less effective against fentanyl than heroin, since fentanyl's extreme potency allowed it to displace methadone from receptors at doses that still produced euphoria. Patients stabilized on methadone who used fentanyl-contaminated heroin experienced effects they shouldn't have felt, breaking through the medication's protective blockade. This pharmacological difference meant methadone provided less insurance against relapse in the fentanyl era, compared to previous decades when heroin predominated. However, methadone still prevented withdrawal and reduced the frequency of opioid-seeking behavior, providing significant mortality reduction even if not complete protection. Naloxone distribution programs beginning in the mid-2000s created another layer of overdose prevention that complemented methadone treatment. Training users and their associates to recognize overdose symptoms and administer naloxone rescue shots saved thousands of lives annually. Methadone patients received naloxone kits as standard protocol, reducing deaths from both accidental methadone overdoses and relapses to fentanyl-contaminated street drugs. The combination of methadone maintenance preventing most drug use, plus naloxone rescue for breakthrough use or accidental exposures provided overlapping safety nets that reduced mortality more than either intervention alone. Medication for opioid use disorder became the accepted terminology by 2015, replacing methadone maintenance treatment with language emphasizing medical legitimacy. The reframing attempted to reduce stigma by presenting methadone, buprenorphine, and the newer injectable naltrexone formulations as equally valid medical treatments, rather than controversial substitution therapies. Public health agencies, including the CDC and National Institute on Drug Abuse, endorsed these medications as gold standard treatments, citing evidence that they reduced overdose death by 50 to 75% compared to abstinence-based approaches. The scientific consensus supporting medication treatment was overwhelming, yet access remained limited and stigmatized. Roughly 450,000 Americans received methadone treatment in 2018, serving just a fraction of the estimated 2 million people with opioid use disorder. Clinic capacity remained insufficient in most communities, with waiting lists extending weeks or months while people died from overdoses. The daily attendance requirement continued, excluding patients whose employment, childcare responsibilities, or transportation limitations made clinic visits impossible. Geographic distribution left rural areas almost completely unserved, since clinics concentrated in urban centres where patient populations supported their operational costs. The treatment system designed in the 1970s remained largely unchanged despite 5 decades of evidence about what worked and what created unnecessary barriers. The COVID-19 pandemic forced regulatory changes that methadone advocates had demanded for years without success. Federal agencies relaxed take-home restrictions in March 2020 to reduce infection exposure from daily clinic visits, allowing stable patients to receive up to 28 days of medication at once. This sudden flexibility demonstrated that previous restrictions reflected policy choices rather than pharmacological necessity. Patients managed take-home doses responsibly when given the opportunity, with diversion rates remaining stable or even declining. The pandemic changes improved patient quality of life dramatically while maintaining safety, raising questions about why such reasonable accommodations had been denied for so long. Overdose deaths reached historic highs during the pandemic, exceeding 100,000 annually for the first time in 2021, as fentanyl contamination became nearly universal in street opioid supplies. Methadone treatment enrollment increased modestly, but expansion couldn't keep pace with the exploding need for services. The waitlist grew longer even as deaths accelerated, creating the unconscionable situation where people died from preventable overdoses while on waitlists for medication proven to reduce mortality by half. Some communities developed low-barrier methadone programs that enrolled patients immediately without the counseling requirements and bureaucratic screening that delayed treatment at traditional clinics, demonstrating that rapid access was possible when programs prioritized it. The racial disparities in methadone access reflected broader healthcare inequities, with Black and Hispanic individuals facing longer wait lists and receiving lower doses than white patients for equivalent addiction severity. Research documented that providers harbored implicit biases affecting prescribing decisions, often underdosing patients of color based on stereotypes about drug-seeking behavior. These disparities contributed to higher overdose mortality among minority populations, despite similar or lower rates of opioid use disorder. Addressing the inequities required confronting racism in addiction treatment systems that had historically over-policed and undertreated communities of color. The medication's complicated history, from Nazi military medicine to controversial addiction treatment to life-saving intervention in America's worst drug epidemic, created layers of meaning that influenced its reception in ways pure pharmacology couldn't explain. Methadone worked through simple receptor binding and neurochemical stabilization, yet its use triggered debates about moral desert, medical philosophy, and what society owed its most marginalized members. The drug had no inherent politics or ethics, just molecular properties that happened to address a desperate human need. Everything else was projection. Gustav Erhard and Max Bockmuehl, the IG Farben chemists who synthesized methadone in 1937, both survived World War II and continued pharmaceutical careers in post-war Germany. Neither faced war crimes prosecution despite their employers' use of slave labor and collaboration with Nazi medical atrocities. they published little about their most consequential creation, moving on to other research while their wartime compound spread through American addiction treatment. Earhart died in 1971, the same year the FDA approved methadone for maintenance treatment. Bockmuehl lived until 1983, long enough to see his molecule serving purposes he couldn't have imagined. Neither man ever publicly commented on methadone's transformation from battlefield analgesic to addiction medicine, leaving no record of their thoughts about the pharmaceutical legacy they created. The current opioid crisis kills more than 80,000 Americans annually, while effective treatment remains artificially scarce due to regulations, stigma, and the persistent belief that helping addicts survive constitutes moral hazard. Methadone sits at the center of this contradiction. Proven life-saving medication that society provides grudgingly under conditions designed to remind patients of their unworthiness. The chemical compound itself remains pharmacologically identical to what Earhart and Bockmuehl created 87 years ago, but its meaning has been repeatedly reconstructed through historical contingency, political struggle, and ideological conflict. A drug is just molecules until humans decide what it means and who deserves access. The final accounting shows roughly 5 million Americans have received methadone treatment since Dolan Niswander's first patient in 1964, with tens of thousands alive today who would have died without access to the medication. The treatment prevented an estimated 500,000 overdose deaths over 6 decades, reduced HIV transmission by hundreds of thousands of infections, and decreased crime by incalculable amounts. These benefits came despite rather than because of the regulatory environment, achieved by patients and providers navigating systems designed to limit rather than optimize treatment. Imagine the lives that could have been saved if methadone had been provided generously instead of grudgingly, as medical treatment instead of punishment wrapped in healthcare. The question that haunts methadone's history is whether a medication created in such moral darkness can redeem itself through lives saved, or whether its Nazi origins permanently taint its therapeutic use. The answer probably depends on whether you're dying from opioid addiction, and methadone represents your best chance for survival. Chemistry has no memory, and molecules carry no moral weight, only humans do. The substance synthesized to help Wehrmacht soldiers endure bullet wounds now helps Americans survive their country's abandonment to addiction and overdose. That transformation doesn't erase methadone's origins, but demonstrates that tools themselves are neutral, awaiting human decisions about how they'll be used. We can judge the chemists who created it, the regime that employed them, and the systems that restricted its use, but the medication itself just is. The shame belongs to those who withheld it from people who needed it, not to the people who needed it to survive.